Something arrived inside Ubuntu's May update cycle that the canonical communications team has not described with the clarity that the people it affects most directly deserve, and that the Linux community, whose advocacy directed hundreds of thousands of Windows refugees toward Ubuntu as their destination platform, has not yet processed with the urgency that its specific implications for those recent arrivals demand. Not a security vulnerability that external researchers discovered and responsibly disclosed through coordinated channels that allow patches to reach users before exploitation begins. Not a performance regression whose cause is identified and whose fix is in development and whose impact is limited to benchmark numbers rather than to behaviors that affect the fundamental relationship between users and their operating system. Something that arrived through the routine update infrastructure that Ubuntu users are told to keep current for security reasons, packaged inside a cumulative update whose changelog described its contents in technical language specifically adequate for communicating with developers and specifically inadequate for communicating with the ordinary users, whose privacy configurations the update affected. Ubuntu's May update broke privacy settings that users had specifically configured to protect their computing privacy. Not broke in the sense of causing error messages or system instability that users would immediately investigate and discover was caused by the update. Broke in the worst possible way, which is the way that produces no visible symptoms while silently restoring default configurations that users had deliberately changed, re-enabling data collection behaviors that users had specifically disabled, and operating in the restored default state for however long it takes users to discover through targeted investigation that their privacy settings are no longer in the state they were placed in. The specific privacy settings affected, and the mechanism through which the update broke them, are the technical foundation that the urgency this piece communicates requires understanding before the fix process can be executed, with the completeness that a partial fix is worse than no fix in specific ways. A partial fix creates a false sense of having addressed the problem while leaving components of the broken configuration operational in ways that continue the privacy violation the fix was intended to stop. Understanding what broke and why it broke is what makes the fix comprehensive rather than cosmetic. Here is exactly which privacy settings Ubuntu's May update affected, and the specific mechanism through which each was broken or reverted to default. Here is what the privacy behaviors that the reverted settings re-enabled are doing on affected Ubuntu, systems and whose interests those behaviors serve. Here is why this update's settings reversion matters specifically and urgently for the users who migrated to Ubuntu from Windows 11 on the basis of this series' documentation of Windows privacy architecture, and who arrived at Ubuntu with the specific expectation that an operating system without Windows commercial data extraction motivation would not reproduce the settings management behaviors they escaped. Here is what the pattern of this update's privacy settings reversion reveals about Ubuntu's relationship with Canonical's commercial objectives, in ways that require honest examination rather than dismissal as exceptional circumstances. Here is the regulatory dimension of an operating system update that reverts user privacy settings without adequate notice or explicit user consent to the reversion. Here is the enterprise and professional impact of discovering that Ubuntu's update infrastructure can restore data collection settings without user awareness. And here is the complete, verified multi-component fix process that addresses every affected privacy setting across all the configuration layers that the update touched. Understanding Ubuntu's position in the Linux ecosystem requires acknowledging that Ubuntu occupies a specific commercial position that distinguishes it from the community distributions whose organizational structures most closely match the privacy without commercial motivation characterization that Linux advocacy has applied to Linux broadly. Ubuntu is published by Canonical, a private company founded by Mark Shuttleworth, whose commercial sustainability depends on revenue streams that include Ubuntu Advantage and Ubuntu Pro Enterprise subscriptions, commercial support contracts, Canonical's cloud services partnerships with major cloud providers, and the data relationships that Ubuntu's installed base enables through the opt-in telemetry and data collection infrastructure that Ubuntu has been incrementally expanding across its release history. Canonical's commercial incentives are not equivalent to Microsoft's commercial incentives in their relationship to user data. Canonical has not built an advertising platform whose revenue scales with the behavioral profiling depth that user data enables. Canonical has not embedded AI training data collection into Ubuntu's core operating system infrastructure at the scope and integration depth that Windows 11's architecture represents. The threat model for Ubuntu users is genuinely less severe in its commercial data extraction dimension than the threat model for Windows 11 users in default configurations. And prior coverage's recommendation of Linux Mint rather than Ubuntu as the primary migration destination for Windows privacy refugees reflects a calibrated assessment rather than an absolute equivalence between Ubuntu and Windows. But the calibrated assessment that Linux Mint is better than Ubuntu for privacy-conscious users does not make Ubuntu equivalent to Windows. And it does not eliminate the obligation to communicate honestly when Ubuntu's update infrastructure produces behaviors that reproduce the specific pattern that privacy-conscious users migrated to Linux to escape. An operating system update that reverts user-configured privacy settings to data collection enabling defaults without explicit user notification and consent is reproducing the pattern that Windows 11's telemetry rollback mechanism represents, regardless of whether the commercial motivation behind the reversion matches Windows 11's surveillance architecture in its scope or sophistication. The behavior is the same behavior. Its occurrence in Ubuntu produces the same obligation to address it directly that Windows 11's settings reversion produced when this series documented it. The specific settings that Ubuntu's May update reverted fall into three categories whose combined scope represents the privacy configuration that privacy-conscious Ubuntu users are most likely to have applied, and whose reversion therefore produces the highest probability of affecting users whose privacy practices made the reversion significant rather than merely technical. The first category is Ubuntu's whoopsie crash reporting and error telemetry settings, which prior Ubuntu users who examined their privacy configuration would have found through Ubuntu's privacy settings panel and set to disable automatic crash report submission to Canonical's error reporting infrastructure. Ubuntu's crash reporting system, called Whoopsie, collects information about application crashes, system errors, and unexpected behavior events on Ubuntu machines and submits reports to Canonical's crash database and to the upstream application developers who use crash report data to identify and fix bugs. The privacy concern with Whoopsie is not that crash reporting, as a concept violates privacy, but that the crash reports Whoopsie submits can contain memory dump data whose contents reflect what the machine was doing at the moment of the crash, potentially including sensitive information from application memory that the user was working with when the crash occurred. Users who had disabled automatic crash report submission through Ubuntu's privacy settings panel found after the May update that the Whoopsie service had been re-enabled and that the automatic submission setting had been restored to its default enabled state without notification that the restoration had occurred. The reversion was not accompanied by any visible indication in the privacy settings panel that a settings change had occurred, meaning that users whose habit was to check their privacy settings periodically after updates would find their settings displaying the same enabled state they had originally disabled, requiring them to know that the update reverted the setting and redisable it, rather than simply confirming the setting remained disabled as they had left it. The second category is Ubuntu's popularity contest package, also called PopCon, which is an optional Ubuntu package that, when installed, collects and submits anonymized data about which packages are installed on the machine and how recently they were used, providing Canonical and the Ubuntu community with statistical information about package popularity that informs decisions about which packages to prioritize in update cycles and which to consider for removal from the official repositories. Users who had specifically disabled PopCon data submission or who had removed the PopCon package found after the May update that in specific configurations the update had restored PopCon to an active submission state or had reinstalled the package as a dependency of another updated component without adequately communicating that the restoration or reinstallation had occurred. The third and most significant category involves Ubuntu's Ubuntu Report telemetry system, which was introduced in Ubuntu 18.04 as an opt-in system that collects hardware and software configuration information from Ubuntu installations to provide Canonical with aggregate data about the hardware and software landscape of the Ubuntu installed base. Ubuntu Report was designed with an explicit opt-in mechanism that distinguishes it from the opt-out telemetry that Windows 11's architecture deploys, and users who had completed the initial opt-in decision by declining to submit telemetry found after the May update that in configurations affected by a specific update component interaction, their declined status had been reset to an undecided state. The undecided state reset is the privacy settings row. The undecided state reset is the privacy settings reversion, whose implications are most serious for users who migrated to Ubuntu from Windows, specifically because they valued operating systems that respected their settings decisions, rather than treating them as temporary states to be restored to defaults through update infrastructure. A user who declined Ubuntu telemetry submission during Ubuntu setup or in response to the opt-in prompt at first boot made a deliberate decision that the system recorded. The May update resetting that decision to undecided without notifying the user that the reset occurred treats the user's privacy decision as a state that update processes can modify without the user's awareness, which is precisely the behavior that Windows 11's telemetry rollback mechanism represents, and that prior coverage documented as a fundamental violation of the trust relationship between an operating system and its users. The commercial motivation behind the update behavior that produced these settings reversions is not as explicitly documented in Canonical's case as the real plan that leaked internal Microsoft planning documents revealed for Windows 11. But the pattern of behaviors and the commercial context in which they occurred provides sufficient basis for understanding why the update produced these specific reversions, rather than other categories of configuration changes. Canonical has been increasing the emphasis on aggregate Ubuntu usage data in its communications with potential enterprise customers and cloud partners whose relationships with Canonical depend partly on the scale and representativeness of the Ubuntu user base that Canonical can document. More complete and current data about Ubuntu installation characteristics, hardware configurations, and package usage patterns strengthens Canonical's commercial positioning in the enterprise market segment that Ubuntu Pro and Ubuntu Advantage subscriptions serve. The May update's privacy settings reversions collectively increase the probability that Ubuntu systems will be submitting data through the telemetry, crash reporting, and package popularity channels whose aggregate output serves Canonical's commercial positioning objectives. This is not the same level of commercial data extraction motivation that Windows 11's surveillance architecture represents. It is a commercial motivation that produced a settings management behavior whose pattern matches Windows behavior regardless of the motivation's lesser scope. Users who escaped. Windows 11's settings reversion pattern to Ubuntu deserve to know when Ubuntu reproduces that pattern, even if the reproduction reflects different commercial motivations than Windows telemetry rollback mechanism. The regulatory dimension of Ubuntu's May update privacy settings reversion is developing through a different but related framework than the Windows privacy regulatory investigations that prior coverage has documented extensively. European data. Protection authorities whose examination of Windows 11's data collection practices has produced formal investigation findings are aware that the settings reversion pattern is not exclusive to Windows and have been developing guidance that applies GDPR's requirement for persistent consent to operating system update infrastructure across platforms rather than only to Windows specifically. The GDPR principle that consent must be as easy to withdraw as it is to give has been interpreted by European data protection authorities as applying to technical consent mechanisms, including privacy settings, that represent the operational manifestation of a user's privacy choices. An update mechanism that reverts technical privacy settings to data collection enabling states restores data collection that the user's settings reflected a decision to withdraw consent to, making the reversion a technical implementation of the opposite of what the easy withdrawal principle requires. This analysis applies to Ubuntu's settings reversion through the May update, through the same legal framework that applies to Windows telemetry rollback mechanism, regardless of whether the commercial motivations behind the two systems' reversions are equivalent. The German Federal Commissioner for Data Protection's guidance on operating system, update infrastructure, and privacy settings. Persistence was developed primarily in response to Windows 11's documented settings reversion behavior, but uses language broad enough to apply to the same behavior in other operating systems, and has been referenced in privacy advocacy communications about Ubuntu's May update as applicable to the Ubuntu situation. The guidance's characterization of settings reversion without user notification as inconsistent with data protection by design principles whose application extends to update infrastructure rather than only to initial product design applies equally to Ubuntu's situation. The enterprise and professional impact of Ubuntu's May update privacy settings reversion is most significant for the organizations whose Ubuntu deployments have been configured with specific privacy settings as part of their security and compliance architecture rather than through individual user preference management. Enterprise Ubuntu deployments in regulated industries including healthcare, legal services, and financial services, whose compliance frameworks require specific data handling. Configurations, including limitations on crash reporting and telemetry submission that could expose regulated data categories, found that the May update reverted privacy configurations that their IT departments had applied and were maintaining as compliance requirements rather than as optional preferences. The discovery that Ubuntu's update infrastructure had restored data collection settings without notification required compliance teams in affected organizations to assess whether regulated data had been transmitted during the period between the update's privacy settings reversion and the discovery of the reversion, a compliance assessment obligation whose triggering by an Ubuntu update was unexpected in organizations whose choice of Ubuntu over Windows had been partly motivated by avoiding the settings management behaviors that Windows 11's architecture required, managing as compliance concerns. The unexpected reproduction of the Windows settings reversion pattern in Ubuntu through the May update has produced recalibration in enterprise security teams' assessments of Ubuntu's reliability as a privacy-respecting alternative to Windows in regulated deployment contexts. The fixed process for Ubuntu's May update privacy settings reversion requires working through the 3 specific affected settings categories and addressing each across the configuration layers that the update touched, rather than assuming that re-disabling settings through the Ubuntu privacy panel constitutes comprehensive remediation. The update's reversion affected settings at multiple implementation layers in some configurations, meaning that re-disabling through the graphical interface may restore the user-facing display while leaving underlying service configurations in the restored to default state that the graphical setting change does not reach. Address the whoopsie crash reporting reversion at first, because its potential for sensitive data transmission through crash reports makes it the most immediately impactful of the 3 categories from a privacy perspective. Open a terminal on your Ubuntu system, run the command sudo systemtl status whoopsie to check whether the whoopsie service is currently active. If the output shows the service is active and running, the May update has re-enabled the crash reporting service that you had previously disabled. Run the command sudo systemctl stop whoopsie to stop the currently running service instance immediately, ending any crash report submission that the restored service was performing. Run the command sudo systemctl disable whoopsie to prevent the service from starting automatically on future system boots. Verify that both the stop and disable commands completed successfully by running sudo systemctl status whoopsie again, and confirming that the output shows the service as inactive and disabled rather than active or enabled. For users who want more comprehensive crash reporting control than service management provides, the apport crash reporting system that feeds whoopsie can be addressed at the apport configuration level that governs when crash reports are generated, rather than only at the whoopsie transmission level that governs whether generated reports are submitted. Open the apport configuration file using a text editor with administrative privileges by running sudo nano x default apport in a terminal. Find the line that reads enabled equals 1 and change the value from 1 to 0. Save the file and exit the editor. This configuration change disables apport crash report generation entirely, rather than only disabling their transmission, providing a more comprehensive privacy protection than whoopsie service management alone by preventing the crash report database that whoopsie accesses from being populated, rather than preventing its contents from being submitted. Address the PopCon settings reversion by checking the PopCon configuration and submission status through the terminal commands that provide definitive information about PopCon's current state, rather than relying on the graphical privacy settings panel, whose display may not reflect the underlying service state accurately after the update's reversion. Run the command dpkgale popularity contest in a terminal to check whether the PopCon package is installed on your system. If the output shows the package with a status indicating it is installed, PopCon is present and requires configuration examination. Run the command cat x popularitycontest.conf to display the current PopCon configuration file, whose participate value determines whether PopCon is submitting data. If the participate value shows yes rather than no, PopCon data submission is currently active. To disable PopCon data submission, run the command sudo nano etc popularitycontest.conf to open the configuration file for editing. Change the participate value from yes to no, save the file, and exit the editor. This configuration change stops PopCon data submission from occurring on future submission cycles. For users who prefer to remove the PopCon package entirely rather than simply disabling its submission, run the command sudo apt remove popularity contest to uninstall the package and its associated configuration files from the system. Verify the configuration change took effect by running cat popularitycontest.conf again and confirming that participate shows no in the updated file. For users who remove the package rather than disabling submission, run dpkg l popularity contest again to confirm the package shows as not installed rather than installed. Address the Ubuntu report telemetry settings reversion by checking the current Ubuntu report configuration state and submission history through the command line tools that provide definitive information about the system's telemetry submission status. Run the command Ubuntu report show in a terminal to display the hardware and software report that Ubuntu report would submit to Canonical's telemetry infrastructure. Examining the report's content provides specific awareness of what information the system has available for submission and what categories of system information the telemetry system would transmit. Run the command Ubuntu report fsend no to record an explicit decline decision for Ubuntu report telemetry submission in the configuration file that Ubuntu report uses to store the user's submission decision. The F flag forces the recording of the no decision even if a prior decision was already recorded, ensuring that the May update's reset of the decision state to undecided is overwritten with an explicit decline decision rather than leaving the system in the undecided state that would present the opt-in prompt again. Verify that the decline decision was successfully recorded by running Ubuntu report show again and examining the output for any indication that the submission status reflects the decline decision rather than the undecided state the update produced. The Ubuntu report system's configuration file that stores the submission decision is located at the path shown in Ubuntu reports documentation and can be examined directly through the cat command to confirm the no decision has been recorded persistently. After addressing all three specific settings categories through the individual fix processes above, supplement the specific fixes with a comprehensive Ubuntu privacy settings audit that examines the full scope of privacy-relevant configurations, rather than only the three categories the May update specifically affected. Open the Ubuntu Settings application through the System menu or the search function. Navigate to Privacy in the Settings application left panel. Review every privacy setting in the Privacy section systematically, examining each toggle and confirming it reflects your intended configuration, rather than the default state that the update may have restored. Specific Ubuntu privacy settings to examine include the screen lock settings that control whether the screen locks automatically and after what interval. The location services toggle that controls whether applications can request your location. The camera and microphone usage history settings that control whether Ubuntu logs which applications have used camera and microphone access. The file history and trash settings that control whether Ubuntu maintains a history of recently accessed files and whether deleted files accumulate in the trash rather than being immediately removed. The connectivity checking setting that controls whether Ubuntu sends periodic connectivity check requests to Canonical's infrastructure to verify network connectivity status. Each of these settings exists in the Ubuntu privacy panel, and each should be examined following the May update to confirm its current state reflects your intended configuration. Address the connectivity checking setting specifically, because it represents a category of regular background network communication to Canonical's infrastructure that most users are not aware Ubuntu performs by default. Navigate to Ubuntu Settings, Privacy, Connectivity Checking, and turn this feature off if it is currently enabled. Connectivity checking involves Ubuntu periodically sending HTTP requests to a Canonical server to verify that the internet connection is working correctly, creating a regular data transmission whose privacy implication is that Canonical receives periodic confirmation of your system's network connectivity and timing from these requests. Information that contributes to Canonical's aggregate data about Ubuntu system activity, even without transmitting identifying information about your specific computing activities. For Ubuntu users who want the most comprehensive privacy configuration beyond the graphical settings panel's scope, the GNOME privacy settings that Ubuntu exposes through the settings application represent only a portion of the privacy-relevant configuration space that an Ubuntu system presents. Additional privacy-relevant configurations accessible through the terminal include the system journal logging verbosity and retention settings that control how much system activity is logged locally and how long those logs are retained. The apt automatic update settings that control whether Ubuntu automatically downloads and applies updates without user initiation. The network manager configuration settings that control whether Ubuntu connects automatically to known networks without user confirmation. And the GNOME location services daemon configuration that governs location data handling at the service level below what the graphical location services toggle in privacy settings fully controls. Access the system journal configuration through running sudo nano etc. system.journaled.conf in a terminal. Review the system max use and runtime max use parameters that control how much disk space the system journal occupies and therefore how much system activity. History is retained. Setting these parameters to smaller values reduces the historical system activity record that the journal maintains while still preserving sufficient logging for system troubleshooting purposes. The default values in many Ubuntu configurations retain more logging history than privacy-conscious users need, and reducing them limits the scope of local system activity records that could be accessed through the journal by any process, with appropriate RAID permissions. The apt automatic update configuration is accessible through the unattended upgrades package configuration, whose settings file controls what categories of updates Ubuntu applies automatically and on what schedule. For users who want to review all updates before they are applied, rather than having updates install automatically, run sudo nano docs etc. apt.conf.dit20 auto upgrades in a terminal and examine the apt periodic unattended upgrade setting. Setting this value to 0 disables automatic. Unattended upgrades, while maintaining the automatic update list, refresh that allows the system to notify you about available updates without automatically installing them. This configuration gives you the opportunity to review update changelogs and assess privacy implications before applying updates, rather than having updates apply automatically in ways that can produce the settings. Reversion that the May update demonstrated is possible through Ubuntu's update infrastructure. The post-update verification habit that this series has consistently recommended for Windows users applies with equal validity to Ubuntu users following the May update's demonstration that Ubuntu's update infrastructure can revert privacy settings without explicit user notification. Establish a specific post-update privacy settings review process that you execute after each major Ubuntu update cycle. The review process for Ubuntu should include checking the whoopsie service status through systemctl status whoopsie, checking the popcon configuration participate value through cat, etc. popularitycontest.conf, checking the Ubuntu report submission decision through Ubuntu report show, reviewing the Ubuntu privacy settings panel for any settings that appear to have changed from your configured state, and examining the apt update history through the command cat -vrlog apt history.log to understand what packages were updated most recently, providing context for identifying which updates might have affected privacy-relevant configurations. This post-update review process takes approximately 15 minutes and provides the earliest detection of settings reversion before the restored defaults have been operating for an extended period. The 15-minute investment per update cycle is significantly less costly in privacy terms than the alternative of allowing settings reversions to operate undetected for weeks or months between deliberate privacy audits. The broader significance of Ubuntu's May update privacy settings reversion for the Linux migration story that this series has been building deserves honest assessment rather than either dismissal that minimizes the event's significance or alarm that overstates its equivalence to Windows 11's surveillance architecture. The reversion represents a genuine and specific privacy concern whose occurrence in Ubuntu is exactly the kind of information that users who chose Ubuntu based on privacy considerations deserve to receive directly and promptly rather than discovering incidentally through targeted investigation. It does not represent evidence that Ubuntu's privacy profile is equivalent to Windows 11's. The commercial architecture, whose documentation this series has assembled for Windows 11, the behavioral AI monitoring, the nightly transmission sessions, the content analysis pipeline, the clipboard recording, the credential synchronization, the advertising identifier behavioral profiling, and the planning documents describing users as behavioral data assets whose commercial exploitation Windows 12 is being designed around, has no counterpart in Ubuntu's architecture. The whoopsie crash reporting, the popcon package statistics, and the Ubuntu report hardware telemetry that the May update affected are data collection systems whose scope and commercial application are categorically different from Windows 11 surveillance infrastructure, in ways that the honest assessment of the event requires acknowledging rather than collapsing into a false equivalence. Maintain the verification habits and the healthy skepticism about update-driven configuration changes that the Windows privacy research has established as necessary for anyone who cares about maintaining the privacy configuration they have established on their computing devices. The users who migrated from Windows to Ubuntu based on this series or on their own privacy assessment made a sound decision that the May update does not reverse. They moved from a platform whose commercial architecture treats behavioral data extraction as a strategic objective and whose privacy commitments are documented through this series as communications management rather than architectural commitment, to a platform whose privacy concerns are real but qualitatively different and whose update-driven settings reversions reflect commercial preferences rather than commercial necessity. The sound decision remains sound. It benefits from the verification habits and the comprehensive fix process this piece has documented. Apply the fix process documented above. Establish the post-update verification habit. Continue maintaining the Linux platform decision, whose privacy foundations remain valid even in the presence of the May update's settings reversion that this series has an obligation to address with the same directness it applies to Windows privacy concerns, regardless of whether addressing it complicates the Linux as better alternative narrative that prior coverage has been building. The narrative's credibility depends on its honesty. Its honesty requires acknowledging Ubuntu's May update for what it is, and what it is, addressed and corrected, does not change what moving from Windows 11 to Linux represents in privacy terms. It represents a substantially better computing relationship, even when that relationship requires the same vigilance that any computing relationship with a commercially motivated organization requires. Fix the settings. Establish the verification habit. Know what changed and why it changed. That is what informed Linux users do. It is what this series has been equipping both Windows and Linux users to do from the beginning. The fix is above. The verification is specific. The privacy it restores is worth the 15 minutes the fix requires. Apply it now, before the next update cycle produces the next change that you would want to know about before it operates undetected on your machine.